Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really big one, environmentally harmful agricultural subsidies.
Yeah, it's huge.
I mean, think about it. Agriculture is just fundamental. Our food, fuel, jobs. It's the backbone.
Absolutely. And it's a big but. It's also responsible for some serious environmental headaches.
Right. Things like deforestation, pollution getting into our soil and water.
Biodiversity loss, which is deeply worrying, and a significant chunk of global greenhouse gas emissions, maybe around 20%.
Yeah, about that much. And sort of tangled up in all this is the whole issue of agricultural subsidies.
Exactly. These government supports, they're meant to help the sector prop up farming.
But they often end up making those environmental problems worse. Unintentionally, perhaps, but still worse.
And the scale we're talking about is massive. It's somewhere between, $610 billion and maybe $842 billion going into global agriculture each year. And a really big piece of that, something like $540 billion across 88 countries just between 2013 and 2018, is seen as price distorting and potentially really damaging for the environment.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this a bit. Our mission today is to really get our heads around what makes an agricultural subsidy harmful to the environment.
We need to look at it from different angles, different perspectives.
Yeah, and maybe pinpoint some potential solutions, things being discussed internationally.
Definitely.
So consider this your fast track, hopefully, to understanding a pretty complex issue. We're aiming for those aha moments, without you feeling like you're drowning in data.
And we're drawing heavily on the Tess Ayidri report on agricultural subsidies for this deep dive. It's a really comprehensive source.
Great. So first things first, what exactly is an agricultural subsidy? Where do we start?
Well, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, has a definition. They say it's a financial contribution by a government or a public body.
Okay.
Or any kind of income or price support, really, that gives someone a benefit.
So it's quite broad then, covers direct cash.
Direct cash, tax breaks, yeah, even providing goods or services cheaper than the market rate. It's a wide net.
That makes sense. The government giving the agricultural sector some kind of leg up, economically speaking. But isn't there another definition? From the OECD.
Ah, yes. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They talk about support to agriculture.
Right.
And they define it as government measures giving producers or sometimes consumers an advantage, to boost their income or cut their costs.
Okay, so similar idea, but maybe slightly different phrasing.
Pretty much. They measure it using something called the Producer Support Estimate, the PSE. The core idea is very similar to the WTO's. The main practical difference often lies in how they calculate market price support.
Market price support, that's when policies keep domestic prices higher than world prices.
As sometimes lower, yeah, through things like tariffs or import quotas. So even if cash isn't changing hands directly.
If the government's policies are artificially bumping up prices, that still counts as support. We need to factor that in.
Precisely. And while we're mostly focusing on these direct support measures today,
because they're easier to track.
Easier to measure, exactly. It's worth mentioning there are also what you might call implicit subsidies.
How do those work?
Well, think about the environmental costs of farming, the pollution, the habitat loss. These often aren't fully factored into the price you pay for food.
So the environment is kind of subsidizing the food.
In a way, yes. That lack of accounting for those externalities is a kind of hidden subsidy. But they're really tricky to put a number on accurately, so we'll stick mainly to the direct stuff.
Got it. And it's not just about direct payments or price controls, is it? You mentioned something from the report about land rights in Colombia. That sounded interesting.
Oh yeah, box 1 in the report. It's a fascinating example. For over a century, Colombian law basically said if you settled and farmed public land, you could eventually own it.
So not a cash handout,
but a really powerful indirect incentive. It encouraged people to expand agriculture, especially cattle ranching, often into areas that were really important for biodiversity.
So these less obvious things can act like subsidies, driving land use changes and impacting the environment.
Exactly. They have subsidy-like effects.
Okay, so we've got a handle on what subsidies are, broadly speaking. Now, the crucial bit. How do these supports, often meant to help farmers, end up harming the environment? What's the connection?
The core link is through economic incentives. Subsidies change the signals farmers get.
Right.
They influence what farmers decide to grow, how much they produce, where they farm, the technologies they use, fertilizers, pesticides, machinery.
And those decisions have knock-on effects.
Direct environmental effects.
Yeah.
For instance, if subsidies make fertilizer cheaper, farmers might use more than the crops actually need.
Leading to problems.
Yeah, the excess nitrogen runs off into rivers, causing pollution, algal blooms. Plus, producing and using nitrogen fertilizer releases nitrous oxide, which is a really potent greenhouse gas. Or price supports might encourage farmers to plow up natural grasslands or forests to plant more crops, just to maximize production.
And there's data hinting at this link in the report, isn't there? Something about threatened species?
Yes, figure 1. It's from an IUCN analysis. It shows a positive correlation, basically, where there's more agricultural support per hectare. There also tend to be more species threatened by agriculture per hectare.
Based on recent data?
Yeah, average data from 2016 to 2020. Now, it's really important. Correlation isn't causation.
Doesn't prove one causes the other.
Exactly. But it strongly suggests there's a link. More support seems connected to more pressure on biodiversity.
So looking at the types of subsidies, are some generally seen as worse than others for the environment?
Yeah, there's a fair bit of consensus in the research on this. Market price support, like we discussed.
Right.
Payments tied directly to how much of a specific crop or product you produce, output payments.
So the more you grow, the more you get.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
subsidies that make inputs cheaper: fertilizers, pesticides, fuel for tractors.
Those are seen as the most problematic.
Generally, yes, because they most directly encourage farmers to ramp up production, use more resources, intensify their operations. This often leads to habitat loss, more pollution, less biodiversity.
And these are often the ones flagged by the WTO too, right, as trade distorting.
Often, yes, because they directly incentivize more production, which can flood markets and affect trade patterns.
Can you give us another clear example? Like, how does a feed subsidy play out?
Sure. If animal feed is subsidized, it makes it cheaper to raise livestock. That can incentivize farmers to increase their herd sizes.
More cows, more sheep.
More animals mean more methane from digestion, more nitrous oxide from manure, more nitrogen pollution if the manure isn't managed well. Plus, you often need more land to grow the feed itself or for grazing.
Okay, that really paints a picture of the potential downsides. But hang on, are all agricultural subsidies bad for the environment? Surely not.
No, absolutely not. The report makes that clear. Some are less harmful, and some can even be beneficial.
Like what?
Well, things called decoupled payments. These are payments not directly linked to current production levels.
So you get the payment regardless of whether you plant corn this year.
Sort of, yeah. Or payments for taking land out of production, like land retirement schemes. Those tend to be less harmful.
And beneficial ones.
Payments for providing non-commodity outputs. That sounds jargony, but it means paying farmers for things other than crops or livestock.
Like environmental services?
Exactly. Maintaining wetlands, planting trees, creating buffer strips of natural vegetation along rivers to catch runoff. Things that help the environment. These subsidies reward farmers for stewardship, not just output.
So it really matters how the money is delivered, not just how much.
Precisely. The design is critical. And the environmental impact is super context dependent.
What do you mean by context?
Well, it depends on the amount of support, how long it lasts, how farmers actually react to it.
Farmer behavior, right?
Yeah. And whether there are environmental conditions attached, like you only get the subsidy if you follow certain rules, that's often called cross-compliance.
Okay.
And of course, the local environment itself matters. The soils, the climate, the existing ecosystems. What's harmful in one place might be less so or differently so somewhere else.
Wow, it sounds incredibly complex, like trying to untangle a big knot. And it's not just about the environment in isolation, is it? You've got other goals competing.
That's a crucial point. We're often dealing with tricky trade-offs. Things like supporting rural communities, farmers' livelihoods, ensuring food security.
You can't just look at emissions, for example.
Exactly. You might have a policy to improve animal welfare, but maybe that particular approach slightly increases greenhouse gas emissions. Or a policy to boost local food production for security reasons might accidentally encourage environmentally damaging farming if it's not designed carefully.
So finding the sweet spot is tough.
There are rarely easy answers. It's always about navigating these complex trade-offs between different, often equally valid policy goals.
And the report mentions something called market leakage. What's that about? It sounds leaky.
Yeah. Market leakage is a really important concept, especially in a globalized world. It's basically when environmental rules in one country cut local production.
Which sounds good, right? fewer emissions here.
Locally, yes. But if that production just shifts to another country with weaker environmental rules, the global environmental benefit might be zero. Or it could even make things worse overall.
So you fix the leak here and it just pops up somewhere else, maybe even stronger.
That's the idea. It means even well-intentioned national policies need to think about the global picture. Otherwise, you're just shuffling the problem around.
That leads into something else that really jumped out at me from the report. This finding from some models that removing certain subsidies, like market price support, might actually increase global greenhouse gas emissions. That sounds completely backwards.
It does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it? Table 1 in the report touches on this. While many studies show removing market price support reduces emissions in the country doing it.
Because production might drop or become more efficient.
Right, but some models suggest that on a global scale, emissions could actually tick up slightly.
How?
Well, if removing protection lowers prices in that country, global demand for that product might increase. If that extra demand is met by ramping up production in places where farming is more emissions intensive,
Or just by increasing total global production overall.
then the net effect on global emissions could actually be negative. The report does say these effects are often quite small, but still.
It's a real head-scratcher. It just shows how interconnected everything is. You pull one lever here, and something unexpected happens over there.
Exactly. It highlights the complexity of global agricultural markets and environmental impacts.
Okay, wow. So if just identifying broad categories like market price support isn't always enough, how do we get more granular? How can we really pinpoint the subsidies causing the most environmental harm in specific situations?
Well, one place to look for clues mentioned in the report is the WTO Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies.
Fishing, how does that help with farming?
The issues are different, obviously overfishing versus land use and pollution. But the process of negotiating that agreement, figuring out how to identify and discipline subsidies based on their negative impact on fish stocks, on sustainability, that offers valuable lessons. Box 3 hints at some takeaways.
So learning from how they tackled a similar problem in a different sector makes sense. What other approaches are there for agriculture specifically?
The EU has done some interesting work. They carried out this huge meta-analysis, basically combining the results of over 570 separate studies.
Wow, 570. What were they looking for?
They were trying to link specific farming practices to their environmental impacts, positive or negative.
Getting down to the nitty-gritty of what actually happens on the farm.
Exactly. Table 2 in the report shows some examples of practices with generally positive impacts, according to this analysis. Things like organic farming, managing grasslands well, using cover crops to protect the soil.
So identifying subsidies that encourage those good practices could be a way forward.
Potentially, yes. This kind of detailed analysis helps build an evidence base for what works environmentally.
But I guess it's not always simple. Even good practices might have downsides.
That's the catch. The report points this out too. Take no-till farming, great for reducing soil erosion, right?
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
But in some situations, it might mean farmers rely more on herbicides to control weeds, or it could lead to more nitrates leaching into water under certain conditions. So again, context and trade-offs matter.
Always trade-offs. Okay, and then there was this framework mentioned, DPSIR, Driver Pressure State Impact Response. Sounds a bit technical.
It's a way of thinking, really. Figure 2 lays it out. It helps map the chain reaction. The drivers are the human activities, in our case, agricultural practices.
Like intensive livestock farming, maybe.
Good example. That driver then creates pressures on the environment, like methane emissions or manure runoff. These pressures lead to changes in the state of the environment, poorer air quality, polluted water, which then causes impacts like harm to biodiversity or human health. Subsidies can amplify those initial drivers.
So subsidies can make the harmful practices more likely or more intense.
Precisely. And Figure 3 shows how you could apply this DPSIR thinking specifically to biodiversity. You link the type of subsidy support to harmful practices, and you also factor in how vulnerable the local ecosystem is.
So it helps you target the subsidies linked to the most damaging chains of events in sensitive areas.
That's the goal. Of course, you need good data and objective indicators to make it work. But the report mentions sources like Felstat, IPBEs, UNEP that can help.
And the UN has some accounting framework for this, too.
Yeah, the System of Environmental Economic Accounting, or SEA. It's a way to integrate environmental data into national economic accounts, which can help track environmentally harmful subsidies.
Right, so we're getting better tools to identify the problems more precisely. But that brings us back to those policy trade-offs we mentioned. How do we actually deal with them? balancing environment, food, livelihoods.
It's the core challenge, isn't it? Often called the triple challenge. Food security and nutrition, livelihoods for farmers in rural communities, and environmental sustainability. They're all vital.
And they can pull in different directions.
Absolutely. Take ruminant livestock cows, sheep. They're major sources of greenhouse gases like methane and nitrogen pollution, and they use a lot of land.
What?
But they're also a crucial source of protein for billions and livelihoods for millions, often in marginal areas where other farming is difficult.
So just saying cut livestock numbers isn't simple.
Not at all. You have to consider the impact on protein availability, farm incomes, maybe even cultural practices. And then there's the whole intensive versus extensive debate. Different systems have different impacts.
And similar issues with crops.
Yeah, cropland intensification. It's given us huge yield increases, which is essential for feeding a growing population.
But the environmental cost
Can be high. Heavy reliance on synthetic fertilizers means greenhouse gas emissions, water pollution. The report flags hotspots like the Yangtze River Basin in China, where nitrogen pollution is a major issue.
So given these complexities and the political difficulty, just slashing all subsidies probably isn't realistic.
It's often seen as politically very difficult, yes. And it could have really harsh impacts on farmers, especially vulnerable ones. That's why the conversation is shifting more towards repurposing subsidies.
Redirecting the money.
Exactly. Shifting support away from the most harmful practices and towards things that promote sustainability. Supporting innovation, research, and development for greener farming methods. That often seems like a more practical and politically feasible path.
Okay, repurposing, not just removing.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Now, the report talks about building a sort of shared understanding internationally about what counts as harmful, almost like a menu of options for reform. What's on that menu?
Well, one major focus is on support that's directly linked to production levels.
The ones we said often incentivize intensification.
Right. These often fall into the WTO's amber box category. They're seen as likely to be the most environmentally harmful because they give such a strong signal to produce more and use more inputs.
But with the caveat that not every single one is automatically bad everywhere.
Exactly. And other types of subsidies can cause harm too. It's not black and white, but it's a key area to look at.
Okay, what else is on the menu?
Enhanced monitoring and transparency. This is crucial. We need better, more standardized ways for countries to report on the environmental impacts of their farm support.
So everyone can see what's happening.
Yeah, and regular reviews to check if environmental conditions or safeguards are actually working. Peer pressure can be effective.
Another option mentioned is differentiating support by commodity, focusing on the big emitters.
Yes, targeting reforms towards subsectors with particularly large environmental footprints, like perhaps ruminant livestock, given the emissions intensity.
But that has limits too, right?
It does. Because, as we said, the environmental impact varies hugely depending on how and where things are produced. Beef production in one system can have a very different footprint from another.
So focusing on the practices might be better.
That's another key item on the menu. Differentiating support based on farming practices. This has two sides.
Encouraging the good stuff.
Right. Developing a shared list of environmentally friendly practices building on that EU research. Maybe. And directing subsidies towards farmers who adopt them.
And the flip side.
Discouraging the bad stuff. Defining practices known to cause environmental damage, maybe using that DBSIR framework and making sure subsidies don't support them, perhaps even making the absence of harmful practices a condition for getting support.
Rewarding good behavior, penalizing bad, seems logical. But getting everyone to agree on the lists.
That's the challenge, especially internationally. And you need objective indicators.
Then there is this idea of rebuttable presumption. Sounds legalistic.
It kind of is. The idea would be to define a core group of subsidies that are presumed to be environmentally harmful.
Guilty until proven innocent.
Sort of. Unless the country providing the subsidy can demonstrate otherwise show that specific design features or local context mean it's not causing significant harm.
So it shifts the burden of proof.
Yes. It could account for nuances.
Yeah.
But again, agreeing on the threshold for proof and what evidence is needed is really difficult, as the fisheries talks showed. And it could be tough for developing countries with less capacity for monitoring and analysis.
Which brings us neatly to developing countries. The report stresses the need for effective special and differential treatment, S&DT. Why is that so vital here?
Because the situation is often very different. Many developing countries contribute very little, historically and currently, to the global environmental problems caused by subsidies.
Their subsidies might be smaller scale or just different type.
Often, yes. And agriculture is frequently critical for basic livelihoods and food security for millions of small-scale, low-income farmers. Applying the same reforms rigidly across the board could be devastating.
So S&DT means giving them flexibility.
Exactly. Longer transition times to adapt, maybe exemptions for certain types of support or for particularly vulnerable groups of farmers. It's about balancing the environmental goals with development needs and fairness.
Acknowledging different realities and capacities. Okay, so we've got ideas for identifying and reforming subsidies, but farming and the environment are global.
Yeah.
Doing this just country by country, is that enough?
The report argues pretty strongly that it's not. National reforms are absolutely the necessary first step. You have to get your own house in order. But international cooperation is crucial to actually achieve global goals.
Why? To avoid that leakage problem.
That's a big reason, yes.
Yeah.
To stop the problem just moving elsewhere. Also, to avoid a patchwork of different uncoordinated approaches. Cooperation allows countries to learn from each other, use peer pressure.
And avoid situations where one country reforms and suddenly finds its farmers can't compete with subsidized farmers elsewhere.
Exactly. Addressing competitiveness concerns is key to making reforms stick politically. International cooperation helps level the playing field.
So what does this cooperation look like in practice? Are there places this is already happening?
Well, there are existing frameworks and forums. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework specifically mentions subsidy reform in Target 18.
Right.
And you have bodies like the WTO, the OECD, the G20, FAO, the World Bank.
Right.
Lots of places where these discussions can happen, and sometimes do.
And what kind of actions could they take together?
Various things. Trying to build sustainability criteria into new WTO rules, though progress there tends to be slow. Facilitating exchanges of best practices on reform. Enhancing transparency through common reporting formats and peer reviews like we discussed. Maybe even developing collective guidelines on how to design less harmful subsidies, or encouraging countries to make voluntary commitments to reform.
So a whole toolkit of cooperative approaches.
Yeah, using the international structures we already have to push things forward together.
It really sounds like reforming these subsidies is incredibly complicated, but also incredibly important.
That sums it up pretty well. It's complex, touching on economics, environment, social issues, trade. But addressing these harmful subsidies is a really critical piece of the puzzle if we want a more sustainable food system and hope to meet our global environmental targets.
Definitely feels that way after this discussion. Okay, so a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Think about the food on your plate. How much do you know about the policies that might have shaped how it was grown or raised? What role do you think these agricultural subsidies play in the environmental footprint of what you eat? And maybe, what new questions does this deep dive raise for you about sustainable food, consumption, and global trade? Some big things to consider. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.